and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host. Now, to reach your full potential as a leader, as an employee, as a person, it's critical that you understand what motivates you. On Project HR, we talk a lot about corporate values, understanding your corporate culture and your employer brand. What we don't often talk about are your personal values, the things that make you you. So in this episode of Project HR, we're talking with motivational speaker Brant Menswar, the founder and CEO of Rockstar Impact and the author of Black Sheep, Unleash the Extraordinary, Awe-Inspiring, Undiscovered You, his new book that promises to help us do just that. Brant, welcome to Project HR.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So I first met you when you spoke and emceed at a Q conference back when we were able to do such things.
Yes.
And I was introduced to Rockstar Impact at that point. Can you tell me a little bit about what Rockstar Impact is and how it came to be?
Sure. It's my consulting firm that really focuses in the area of core values and purpose. So as you said in the introduction, everyone has their organizational core values, which is great. And they are there for everyone to see on their websites. But the question is, how do your employees engage with them? And that requires them to figure out what matters most to them. They have to find their own personal core values in order to build bridges to those organizational values. And so that's what my company does. It helps build those bridges.
Love that. So let's fast forward a little bit to Black Sheep. In Fast Company magazine earlier this year, you shared the story of what inspired you to define Black Sheep values and to write this book. Can you share that story with our listeners?
So in 2012, my oldest son, Theo, was diagnosed with a rare blood cancer that required a bone marrow transplant. And so we began a very lengthy journey, a 263-day journey in the hospital at Florida Hospital for Children in Orlando, Florida. And what happened was the bone marrow transplant he received went well, but he ended up developing something called graft versus host disease. And this is where the marrow that's inserted into the body doesn't recognize the environment that it was placed in. And so it begins to attack the organs. And that's what was happening. There are 4 different levels, and the 4th level will kill you. And unfortunately, that's what Theo had. And so the way that they treat it is you super suppress the immune system so the body won't fight back. And that's what they did. And so the doctors suppressed it with massive chemotherapy. And what ended up happening was he contracted this deadly fungus whose treatment was to super boost the immune system. So we had 2 things that were threatening his life with opposite treatments that created this zero-sum game. And so a couple hundred days into our journey, my wife and I got called into the parents' lounge, and there was a row of doctors sitting in there. And they said, "We are so sorry, but there's nothing else we can do. No matter what we treat, the other's going to take his life, and we don't think he's going to make it through the night. So you should probably go in and say your goodbyes and call who you need to call." Wow. And, we were not prepared for that. We knew it was rough, but not dire. And, what do you do when you're faced in that moment? We stood up, walked back to his room, grabbed his younger brother, sat on the edge of the bed and, tried to find the words to say goodbye. And it's, as a parent, it is something that you never want to have to experience. It's not something you ever truly get over. I think it haunts you.
Yeah.
But, we sat there and, in that moment, I was just a swirling tornado of emotions, and I didn't really have anything to ground me. And so I said my goodbyes. I called my younger brother, who lives in New Hampshire, 1,500 miles away. And I said, "Listen, if you're going to say your goodbyes, you're going to have to do it over the phone. I'm sorry. You're not going to have time to make it." And so he did. He was incredibly distraught. And that night he felt helpless. So he sat on his couch, he filmed himself holding these poster boards, sort of describing the scenario that we were facing. My nephew's dying. We're running out of time. He has less than 24 hours. He's got this. We've tried that. Please help us if you have any ideas. And he never said a word. He simply held up these poster boards and played the song Fix You by Coldplay in the background. And when the song was done, the video was done, and he uploaded it to YouTube. I sat on the edge of my son's bed all night, sort of waiting for him to pass. And he had made it through the night. And the next morning, my phone is ringing off the hook. I am trying to be present. I'm trying to ignore it and then just sort of take in every last moment I possibly can. But after a few hours, my phone is literally hot from vibrating. And so I finally grab it and take a look at it. And I have all these messages and all these texts and emails from people that I don't know. And so what I did not know, my brother had made that video and uploaded it to YouTube. But by the time I grabbed my phone, the video had already been seen over 500,000 times.
Wow.
And so I started to get these messages from people all over the world. Some of them were doctors. One of them happened to be at MD Anderson at Houston and said, I don't know if your doctor is aware, but there is this new treatment that might allow you to treat both things at the same time. Would you mind if I have a conversation with him? And so we put them together, and then I got a call from Dr. Tim Johnson from Good Morning America, and he said, you tell your doctor anybody he wants to speak to, get me a list, and I'll do my best to make it happen in the next 24 hours. That's exactly what he did. So we spoke to someone at Dana-Farber in Boston. We spoke to a research scientist at Cornell University. The 4 doctors put their heads together. They came up with this crazy plan to try to save Theo's life. And it worked. So we went from say your goodbyes to a treatment plan in just over 24 hours. Theo just turned 23 years old. He
Incredible.
actually designed the cover of my new book. He's going to school for graphic design. And, I sat there for years afterwards. This was in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
For 5 or 6 years afterwards, I went to bed every night with one question in my head, Jennifer, and that was, I wonder if he thinks I gave up on him. Because the truth was, when I sat on the edge of that bed, I was flailing. I had nothing in my life figured out.
Yeah.
What were my non-negotiables? What were my, personal core values that I could hold on to? And in my early 40s, I had no answer for that. And so I let my emotions get the best of me, and I made some really horrible decisions. And so I go back now. The reason I wrote this book is because everybody should be prepared if you're ever going to have to face a moment like that in your life. And so the book teaches you how to discover what I call your flock of 5, your 5 black sheep values that you can use to make better decisions in moments like that.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Sure.
So today, where you've come to, you call yourself a core values activist. And I find that fascinating, that phrase. And so I want to talk about what you mean by black sheep and why this concept forms the core of your philosophy.
I was 47 years old before somebody sat me down and explained to me why farmers don't value black sheep like the rest of the flock. And when I found out the truth, I was so shocked that I had lived 4+ almost 5 decades without knowing this, that it really was the spark that started the idea for this book. And the truth is that the reason that farmers don't value black sheep like the rest of the flock is because a black sheep's wool cannot be dyed. So every black sheep, in effect, is 100% authentically original, and it cannot be made into something that it wasn't meant to be. That is my life's goal, is to be that 100% authentic creation that I was meant to be. And so
Fantastic.
That's where the idea for the book came from.
I love that. So what does it mean to start with why? Why is that a wrong concept in the framework of the black sheep?
Well, first let me say, I think Simon Sinek is a brilliant man.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that.
I just happen to disagree with him in this particular case. And it should just be that I believe that the title of that book should have an asterisk next to it. Yes, you should start with why if you know what your why is. But if you don't know what your why is, you cannot start with it. So the idea that you can start with why, for me, doesn't work, because our why is born from our what. What are those non-negotiable core values? Those values form your why. Our why is something we choose. Our purpose is chosen. It is not found. And so if we're going to make a educated choice deliberately, then we have to know what those non-negotiable values are, because they become our why. And so, it was a couple of years into teaching this philosophy that I was at a conference, at an HR conference, believe it or not. And I sort of said this and said, you can't start with why. And it's a great book, but it's based on something that just doesn't work. And I did not know that Simon Sinek's Start With Why team was in the audience.
Oh, no. Hello.
But I will tell you that they came up to me afterwards and they said they were seeing who was going to have to draw the straw to go back and tell Simon that they agreed with me. And so the idea is you've got to start with what are those non-negotiable black sheep values so that you can choose your why once you figure that out.
So your book says that once we sort out our core values, we can live our truth. And obviously this goes back to the black sheep that can't be dyed.
Sure.
What does that mean? How does it improve our lives to live a truth in that way?
Well, my question, Jennifer, would be, how do you do anything on purpose?
Mm-hmm.
When I ask people what do you mean when you say on purpose? The answer I get most of the time is in being intentional. I'm being intentional.
Sure.
Intention doesn't get it done. I would suggest that the phrase on purpose should be described as something that is in alignment with your purpose. You are making decisions in alignment with your purpose. And that purpose, as we just discussed, comes from those black sheep values. So for me, my black sheep values are creativity, hope, impact, empathy, family, and authenticity. I say we have a flock of 5. I have 6. I spent 20 years as a rock star. We do everything to excess, so I needed an extra, which is fine. But my purpose is to creatively impact others by authentically providing hope. And if it sounds familiar, it's because it's loaded with my black sheep values. That's the alignment that we need. And if you don't have that alignment, if you start with why, I promise you your why is wrong, because what are the odds that they're going to contain any of those non-negotiable values if you don't start there? And that's really what the idea comes from. And this idea of living your truth, those non-negotiables are your truth. They actually are what serve as your guideposts and keep you on the path to making better decisions. And so this idea of living your truth means that you are filtering your decisions through those black sheep values.
I love that. It's a beautiful way to look at things and to live. And yeah, I really want to dig into that. I think we're going to do that in a minute here. We're going to talk a little bit more about how I know every one of our listeners is probably thinking right now, why don't I have a purpose that's that clear and that brilliant? So we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. But when we return, I want to help us understand why it's so important to identify those core values. We'll talk about how we can do that. So stay with us. In human resources, employee, and labor relations, it's actually tough to keep your eye on the ball. With changes to the landscape nearly every day, from legislation to best practices, even great ideas that you know your company might benefit from. Well, honestly, it can be overwhelming. That's why the Union Proof team at Projections developed a Monday morning news digest just for you. Join the Conversation is a completely free resource that gives you just the information you need to kick off your week with the top developments and insights. Our team does all the hard work for you, wading through anything that isn't of value to deliver exactly what you need to know now. Sign up today at unionproof.com/join the conversation. Your future self will thank you. We're back with motivational speaker Brant Menswar, founder and CEO of Rockstar Impact and author of Black Sheep, Unleash the Extraordinary, Awe-Inspiring, Undiscovered You. So, Brant, on your website, you define 125 commonly held values, and that's a lot to take in. But what you're saying is that the key to the black sheep process is finding your own individual core values. Is that right?
That is right. The website has an assessment that we developed specifically to go along with this book. And this black sheep assessment presents you with 125 commonly held core values. And it asks you to read them quickly. And in this knee-jerk reaction, any word that resonates with you, that means a lot to you, go ahead and select it. And what we know after a couple of years of people taking this assessment now, and thousands of people into this, that the average person selects at least 30 things that are incredibly important. So my next question is always, can you tell me what crippling anxiety and depression feels like? Because there's no way that you can honor 30 things on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So the second part of the assessment takes that subgroup of words, however many you selected, 30, 40, 50, 60 words, and it has you group them together by likeness. And so we take words like empathy and sympathy and caring for others, and that goes in one bucket. And we have things like success and achievement and accountability, and that goes into another bucket. And before you're done, all of your words are grouped together in 5 different buckets, and you get to select the one word from each bucket that you cannot live without? What is that one non-negotiable value? And that gets you to your initial flock of 5 black sheep values.
I love that. That's really insightful. So, what accounts for the differences in our personal core values? Is it life experience? Is there more to it?
Well, our core values are developed over the course of our lives. From the moment we're born to about our early 20s is really the forming process of what we're going to decide matters most to us. Our upbringing has a lot to do with it. What Maslow would call peak experiences really have that profound effect, both good and bad, right? So sometimes our values are born out of really powerful positive experiences, and sometimes our values are born out of really powerful negative experiences where we say, I never want that to happen again, or I never want to be that type of person. And it's why this process can sometimes be incredibly difficult, and why people choose not to do it, because it can be painful when you look back and figure out where some of these values were born from. But the mistake that I would tell you is that people think that our purpose changes, that our values change, and that's just not true. Our values are what, and our purpose, our why, rarely change outside of a catastrophic event in your life. They rarely change over the course of your life. What does change is the how you're going to honor it, your mission. So that changes every day with every new person that comes into your life, with every decision that you make. But beyond that, the what and the why are pretty static.
That makes perfect sense. So let's dig in a little bit. You keep talking about the non-negotiables. Let's dig in a little bit and define that. What is that for most people?
Well, I interchange black sheep values with non-negotiables, right? These
Okay.
are the values that no matter how somebody wants to try to influence, change, or twist you in some way, shape, or form, you simply aren't going to be moved from that position. So when I say your black sheep values, what I really mean is your non-negotiable core values.
Okay. So we've defined that. What's the next step in the process once we know what those non-negotiables are?
Well, you have to prove that they're real. What we know over the course of a couple of years now is that the initial flock of 5 that people come to, there are 1 or 2 that are absolutely rock solid and true. And you can give me 20 plus examples over the course of your life as to why they are true. But we also know that there are 2 or 3 in that initial flock of 5 that are total fabricated BS. They are either who you want to be, or maybe who someone has told you you should be, or even you could be caring for someone else's sheep. So it takes some proving. I have a saying that I use a lot in my coaching practice, which is, when you have proof, you don't need belief. Stop trying to convince yourself of something, and instead find the proof so that you know it's real. And there is a 2-week proving phase where you actually have to find proof that these values show up organically in your life each and every day.
So what if someone finds, during this soul searching process that they're not living the values that they believe that they hold most dear? So I'm kind of referring to those aspirational values. What does that mean exactly?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is that if they're aspirational values, they're not going to find any proof of anything. Because they don't exist, right? They are not real. Black sheep do not live in the future; they live in the present. And so the idea is that what if you can't find proof of the value that you say is your non-negotiable black sheep value, then I'm going to question whether or not that value is accurate or not. And that's why we do this sort of tracking. I call it counting sheep. So you have to count sheep every single day to see what's real and what's not. And in some cases, what we find is that people have a tendency to drill down a little too specific with their value, and they lose track of the overarching value that really becomes the non-negotiable. So an example would be if you told me that faith, family, and community were 3 of your black sheep values, I would argue that none of them are your black sheep value, that the value is connection. And you just gave me 3 really powerful ways in which you experience connection to your God, to your community, to your family. But the value is connection. It's not the drilled down answer that you tried to give me. And so that's why we do this proving, because if you got too deep and too specific, then you're going to have a hard time finding evidence when you try to track it.
That's brilliant. I wouldn't have looked at it that way. That's really interesting. So is there a communication aspect to the black sheep process? In other words, is this something that you kind of figure out on your own for your own growth, or is it something where you want to actively share it with others?
Well, the third part of the process is you have to speak these into existence. So it's not just knowing what matters most to you. You have to choose when and where these values appear in your life. That's the only way you can live with deliberate intention, or as I would call it, living on purpose. And so for myself, I spent, even after I figured this out, I did the work. I proved that these things were real, but I did not choose to speak them into existence. I just sort of let them be. And it wasn't until I discovered that I was missing that last little piece that my life didn't change really until I started to program these values into my day with deliberate intention. And that was in January of 2019 is when I literally would start each day with my calendar, and I would look at the appointments I had for the day. And I would write which black sheep needed to show up in which meeting for maximum impact. And the minute I started to do that, my life started to shift. Within 6 months, I went from speaking 20, 25 times a year to 70 plus times a year. My fee tripled. I got named one of the top 10 motivational speakers in the country, along with Amy Cuddy and Jack Nicklaus and Magic Johnson and these incredible people. And that only happened because I started to live my life with deliberate intention. I started to speak these values into existence. And so they literally start to influence my words, what I'm going to say. And by doing that, I actually change what other people are saying about me, right? I'm changing their narrative because they're starting to see proof of the things that matter most to me.
That's beautiful. I hope all of our listeners are thinking this through, and we could all use that kind of purpose and that kind of drive that like you say, live with purpose. So we've got to take some time out for another quick break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the ProjectHR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is motivational speaker Brant Menswar, the founder and CEO of Rockstar Impact and the author of Black Sheep: Unleash the Extraordinary, Awe-Inspiring, Undiscovered You. We are back. So, Brant, tell me, what happens if at the end of this introspection, you find that your core values are at odds with the values of others that you're close to? Have you ever seen this surface within an organization or even within a family?
I think we're witnessing an entire country go through that right now. It's why the division has happened, right? And honestly, for me, over these last, say, 6 or 7 months that we've been living a life that was just not experienced by anyone up to this point. So now we're having to shift where everybody's working from home. We don't have that freedom. So interesting enough, the number one shared value by a 50% margin to the next closest one is connection. And we know that from our assessment. And so that connection has been really strained since March of this year with the pandemic and sort of how we're doing things. And so what you've started to see is people's emotions drive their behavior, especially during an election year. And when you don't have conversations that are rooted in your non-negotiable values, what are you having conversations about? They are about your feelings. Well, your feelings are horrible indicators of truth. And so we see it happen all the time when you start to realize and own what those black sheep values are, and you see people violating those values actively on a regular basis. It changes your relationship with them. It makes you have to sit down and reallocate the time that you have dedicated to different relationships in your life. Doesn't mean you cut people out necessarily. I mean, sometimes they're family, right? And so, but you are definitely going to reallocate the amount of time you devote to those relationships because they are in violation of the things that matter most to you. And so you can't dedicate the time to things that are counterproductive to your non-negotiable values.
Yeah. Real quickly, would you recommend that, like, if you're going to go through this process yourself and finding your own core values and your own black sheep, should you have your other family members do it at the same time?
100%. Anybody in your life that I have a rule with my friends, and even people who maybe they're not my friends, but they want to be friends, is
Right.
I will not discuss politics or religion until you do this, until you define your non-negotiable black sheep values. Once you do that, I can have a conversation that is rooted in the things that matter most. And it helps me understand what you truly care about. And we leave things like the manipulation of facts and all those other sorts of things by the wayside, because we're not talking about somebody's opinion or perception. We're talking about values. And that is a completely different conversation.
Yeah, and I just live by that. We're not talking about religion or politics, so I like that there's an out now. I can have everybody do this
Yes.
process, and we can actually have a conversation.
It's true.
So let's talk about the Black Sheep experience, the coaching program that your company offers. Is this for individuals? Is it for organizations? How does that work?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And so sometimes it's individuals, and sometimes it's teams, right? So I will coach teams at different organizations. I'll coach executive teams. I will coach just sort of tightly knit teams together that might be struggling. And the idea is to get to the truth, to get to those things that are truly the non-negotiables. Because when we do that, we can be way more efficient with our decision-making process, and we can stay more committed to the goals that we establish, because what keeps us committed are these non-negotiable values. And the minute you put that commitment onto a feeling, it's like a roller coaster. It's just up and down and up and down. And so the idea becomes, in that experience, that it's a 5-week process. And we go from taking the assessment to proving what's real, to speaking them into existence, to choosing a purpose statement for your life. And once all that's done, then we can start to build bridges between your values and the organizational values. Because the key to doing this work, I think there wouldn't be anybody out there right now, especially in the HR world, that would argue that we are not in this present moment required to do more with less. We've experienced furloughs, we've experienced layoffs, but company goals are company goals. And so just because we have a 10 or 15% less in the workforce doesn't mean that our goals got reduced by 10 or 15%. So how are we going to make up for that? And the answer is through unique contribution. And that's really the power of those black sheep values. It eliminates this idea of groupthink and just giving this contribution that is what everybody else is doing. And instead, you start to contribute with deliberate intention, meaning that your contribution comes directly from those 5 non-negotiable values, which is going to be completely different than anybody else that's also contributing to the process. So in that light, that's how we maintain commitment and still achieve goals through unique contribution.
And I love that the idea that defining those core values are what are going to move our organizations forward, for ourselves personally and for the organization as a whole. So on your website, the findyourblacksheep.com, we talked about the worksheet that you offer. Where does that play into this process? So obviously the experience you said is a 5-week process. Where is the worksheet the starting point? Tell us a little bit about that.
It depends on where you come into the process, right? So for some people, it's where we start. When I'm doing my keynotes for different organizations and associations, we will have everybody take it as pre-work, right? And so what I'm able to do is I'm able to build these values maps for organizations. So I can tell an organization, here are the top 5 values that your employees care about. And we break them down by gender and by 10-year age gap. So I can tell you what the 20-year-old men think, and I can tell you what the 60-year-old non-binaries think, and and everything in between. And what we start to look for is, do we see any of the organizational values represented in the employee values? And what you're going to find out is that in many cases, that's just not the case. So the need for the bridges to be built becomes paramount for people to truly engage. So if you said that transparency is one of your organizational values, I would have to look at that through my flock, right? So mine being creativity, hope, impact, empathy, family, authenticity. I would need to use those to amplify transparency. I could sit there and ask myself, how can I creatively use transparency to engage my team? How can I use transparency to bring hope to the people that report to me? How can we take transparency and use empathy to connect with our people? And you can see that these are coming directly through my flock, through my values. It's my unique contribution. And that's the thought process that goes into each and every value, especially when they're not shared. We have to build those bridges to connect. And so that's sort of the process that we go through when it comes to the training, the experience of the 5-week coaching program, and then the activation of those values within a corporate structure.
That's all fascinating. We've tried within our organization to define those core values and talk about them. And like you said, everybody has different core values, and that's always been my struggle point. Is how do we build those bridges between what this person and this person believe, and for the greater good of the organization? So that process sounds like it's just a fantastic thing to go through. I also wanted to mention that you have a podcast of your own, and as podcasters, we love to support each other. Can you give us a little shout out about your podcast and what it is that you talk about?
The podcast is called Thoughts That Rock. I co-host it with one of my mentors and very best friends, Jim Knight. Jim was the director of training and development for Hard Rock International for 20 plus years. And we have just fascinating people on our show. Everybody from CNN anchors like Soledad O'Brien to astronauts like Scott Kelly, professional athletes to our friends next door, right? Just our neighbors, because the podcast is about the best piece of advice you've ever been given. That's the one question that we ask every guest. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given, and how did it change your life? And that is, we are now just coming up on our 100th episode in December. Will be number 100. So we are very excited about that.
Nice. And I'm going to hit you up for that question a little bit later. As everybody who listens to our podcast knows, in our lightning round, that's one of our favorite questions to ask. So tell me, how can our listeners find out more about you, your book, your podcast, your organization? Where are those resources?
So BrandtMenswar.com, BrandtMenswar is probably the best way. The book has its own website called FindYourBlackSheep.com. You can find the assessment in both areas, but either one of those would work.
Okay, great. And a link to Brandt's website, his podcast, and a link to the Black Sheep Values worksheet will all be included in this episode's companion guide. So I want to let our listeners know to be sure to sign up for that at projectionsinc.com/podcast. But right now, Brandt, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. So our first question is, in this episode, we've been talking a little bit about black sheep. I'm sure we're not the first to ask you this, but who in your opinion was the better shepherd? Mary, who had a little lamb, or little Bo Peep?
Mary is the answer. And I did research on this. I know this is the lightning round, but I'm going to tell you, I Wikipedia'd this, and I figured out that Mary, this is actually, it's based in a true story. And the she shows up to class, Mary, this young girl, shows up to elementary school with her pet lamb. And the teacher it's too much of a distraction. So the teacher makes the lamb leave, but the lamb waits for Mary to be done with school. And as soon as she's done, it comes right back, and the teacher uses it as a learning moment to say, really, when you care for things with love and affection, they will be there for you when you need them, which is exactly the point of figuring out your black sheep values. Make sure they're there for you when you need them.
That's great. I love that you did research on that. All right. So tell me, what's the best book that you've read recently?
I was very fortunate to get a galley copy here of a book called Swagger by Leslie M. And it's not going to come out until spring, but it is phenomenal.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. Now I'm a little jealous of your galley copy.
Yes.
So tell me, what's your favorite thing about what you do?
Seeing transformation, I would say, is probably my favorite thing. It's coming from the rock world where you are on stage, and I spent 20 years, as a literal rock star. It's so much better to just walk off the stage and watch people sort of the light go on and they go, gosh, I've been winging it my whole life and I need to figure this stuff out so I can start living my life on purpose.
Oh. So tell me, now that we're up to this question, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given? And I will add to that. And how did it change you?
So listen, this is you're right in my wheelhouse now across that rock, but I will tell you that for me, the best piece of advice I've ever sort of found or experienced or been told comes from Maya Angelou, and it is, do what you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And that has been the literal sort of roadmap for me is I do what I can until I know better. And then when I know better, I try to do better. And that it helps in that continuous learning framework that my life is based in.
Nice. So tell me, who or what inspires you?
I would say that it's people who are willing to be vulnerable. Are what truly inspire me. The work of Brene Brown and incredible people like that. I just Unlocking Us, her new podcast is phenomenal, and I'm really inspired by people who are willing to sort of get vulnerable with their feelings and what matters most, so that they can change what's possible for their lives.
Love that. Brant, this has been truly inspirational. I can see that by knowing our sheep, we can all take control of our lives and make the decision to choose on purpose, not just wing it. For that, I truly want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thanks to Project HR's loyal listeners. Don't forget that we've done all the hard work for you by listening back to the podcast and taking notes. You can grab the companion for Brandt's episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. And we're always looking for fresh voices. If you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.